it wasn't a straightforward journey, not just because of the pandemic, but before that as well. But yeah, I like it. It's for me, the interesting part is seeing people read it and talk about it, because you write the whole time and you're in your own space, and then when you're here, not in your own space anymore, talking about the things you wrote when you were in your space. So that's an interesting, slightly surreal feeling. It's a good feeling.
Yeah. Have there been any moments of discovery for you in that process, right? I mean, that moment, as you say, when the book goes from being something that you're just totally trapped in for so long, and then it goes out to other people to find new interpretations, new responses. Have there been things that you've heard or read that people have kind of responded to that have revealed things about the book that you didn't know were there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm asked some things about, because it's a collection, so it's different opinions and understandings from so many different places. And I can't remember what it was specifically, and I'd surprise you when the question came, when the person asked something, and I was like, I never thought about my protagonist like that, but that is true.
Right.
That does exist, or those things, those social classes or whatsoever do exist in such and such story. I think because when you're writing, you're like this close to the work, and then when someone else reads it, it's like holding it at a different angle.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you mentioned, too, that because of the form that it takes, right, that it's a collection of stories, it's a lot harder, I think, to create a kind of cohesive, this is what it is, right? This is what it's about. So I wonder, in the process of putting it together and revising and thinking about it, what that collection form, right, that kind of polyvocal approach to creating something, were there things that it allowed you to write or think about that something like a sustained novel or something that's a little bit more singular wouldn't have, or just generally, were there things that you found in the collection form that you felt really drawn to?
Well, so when I started writing, it wasn't with that point that I'm going to make a collection.
Right.
Okay. I started writing 6-7 years ago in earnest, seriously, despite growing up saying I'm going to write a book one day. But because for a bunch of years I said I'm not going to write. But when that didn't work, and I decided I really need it for, so I don't become a basket case. So all the things that were here that just came out one after the other. There were just 2 times that I remember writing a story and pausing and then writing another one. It was crazy. But I didn't know this would be a collection. And the idea of a collection came when once I started submitting to magazines, and then later on I was like, oh, this could be a collection maybe. And I put them together and I saw that, okay, there is a resonance, even though there is a variety of themes. They're not all about the same thing.
Right.
But there is something linking the whole thing together. So I figured, that could be a collection.
Yeah. And as you were kind of in that experimental mode of putting together the stories, and you found that resonance, what kinds of things created that for you? I mean, just thinking about the connective tissues that we often don't see between stories that we write, like what were those as they came up for you?
Yeah, the connective tissues, all just the preoccupations, right? The things that in some part of your life you're stuck trying to work through, trying to understand. I mean, I don't know why. If somebody said, why do you write? I would say, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure some things out. And this is not the answer, though.
Right.
So there'll be another book. And
it's just a bunch of other questions.
Just a bunch of questions, So the connective tissues were my obsessions or preoccupations with just the idea of people trying to define themselves. And again, that wasn't something I was consciously doing. That was something when I saw later. I'm like, oh, okay. This is why they're all unhappy.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're just trying to define themselves. They lack something. They lack financial stability, or they lack relationship stability, or they lack, some form of stability. They don't have some anchoring. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's really wonderful. And I think that, I was really struck by the variety within the collection. I mean, it's interesting to think about how much you're able to experience that sense of variety in character and in place and in class, right? All of these kinds of things that we use to define the characters, but also that kind of singular thread that runs through so many of them of the distance between how we define them and how they define themselves, right? Those images. Also, in terms of, just thinking about some of these broader themes or ideas within the collection, there's something that I wanted to begin with, which we were briefly mentioning about those.
It's on your phone,
kind of well, I have a screenshot that I would like to read.
Scary.
This is about to be like,
we
I
didn't
have
talk about
something that
this.
you tweeted in 2013, which is about to destroy your life. Not really.
First
but
last book.
this is totally non valuative at all, but it is something that struck me as I was reading, right? So one of the blurbs that exists on the book's Amazon page is from the author Rachel Greenland. She says, "I've never been to Karachi, Pakistan, but I will be forever grateful to Farah Ali for taking me there," which I thought was interesting. Because I also feel like, as I was reading the book, one of the things that I was struck by was, in particular, two of the stories, right, tourism and foreigners, feel to me like they are kind of revealing one of the threads of the collection being a kind of critique or subversion of this desire to kind of, for tourism, right, which is named explicitly in one of the stories, and a little bit less so in foreigners, which is more, I think, about the regulation of borders and of international travel and the effects that has on our interpersonal relationships. But I wanted to just ask a little bit generally about that idea of kind of interrupting this exoticization that can happen around so many places, right? And the particular ways that it happens to Pakistan as it might happen to somewhere like Palestine or, these other countries that we only get through certain narratives. But it's something I was just drawn to in terms of, especially of those two stories, tourism and foreigners.
Also, to your point about the exoticization of those places, because they're like little tag words attached to those places, right? Or whatever people want to latch onto. It's easy, it's digestible. The bigger picture is too hard, too much. It requires too much homework. But for me, because I grew up there in Karachi, and I know it's a chaotic city. It's a bizarrely chaotic city, and I know people who grew up there and they moved out and we're not looking back. But the idea of talking about my city as if it's my problems on a tray and they're portrayed in stories, I didn't consciously do that, and I didn't consciously avoid that either. I wasn't worried if my mentioning a problem that exists back home infrastructurally would be like, aha, we know this is what back home is like. Point made. It's I did grow up with some of those problems, like power outages and whatnot, but that's fine. And I wouldn't avoid talking about it just because it might make my work sound exotic, and also I wouldn't make it sound like, we're all always happy there. Just to give a positive light to that place. It's a place for me. So all places are good or bad. And so in terms of tourism, that's not in Karachi, though the protagonist is from there. It takes place somewhere up north, right? And he's basically escaping his dysfunctional life back home. And the idea was to explore a story where a man is so isolated from everyone around him, and he's in his head. Usually that's the case when there's struggles of, how do I say it? Like mental health struggles, to put it really simply or simplistically. And you can't communicate to people what you're feeling. So he's all up there in his head, and he decides to go up north to get away from it all. And that's the one story that I name a lot of names, and they're all geographically accurate. Otherwise, I don't like naming names in my stories. I stay far, far away from that. But the idea, again, was not about, look how amazing this place is up north. It's going to fix you and heal you. I think there is some mention in the story about, if you want to get healed, take a Xanax maybe. Sleep a lot, write a little.
Well, and I think so much of that comes through in the linguistic choices of the story, right? Which feel, we were talking about this a little bit, right? It's written in the form of what might be a travelogue, right? Or a kind of brochure for tourism, which I think is why I was drawn to it in the context of that idea, right? Of kind of the desire to go somewhere else to heal, right? And in this story, as you say, it's within the kind of structures and geographical places of Pakistan versus like in Foreigners, the other story, there's so much of it is the relationship between an American, and the idea of living in a new place, right? Living in a place of otherness or of foreignness. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that linguistic choice to kind of like to write it in that style of a brochure. Were there things that it allowed for you that a more, for lack of a better term, like realistic or naturalistic kind of prose didn't?
So in simple, boring craft terms, it's maybe second person POV, though I've been told that it's not. Like, okay.
Yeah.
That's the other part.
It's a little complicated. But
Is it? Who's talking here? Is it all in his head? I think, again, those two were created with such different, they have very different origin stories, Foreigners and tourism.
Yeah.
But they have very clear origin stories, like things happened or I went somewhere. So for Foreigners, the idea was to talk about, it started off with a very simple experience narration, but then it became, I wanted to explore the other side of it. What is that person's life behind the window like? He's having a shitty life too, maybe. So let's talk about that.
And we should say that this story, Foreigners, is constructed totally as one side of a visa interview to go from Pakistan to the United States.
Yeah.
And so the person that we hear from narrating the story is
the officer.
You're right, exactly.
The interviewer, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's kind of ominous because he has all their details,
Right.
even more than he needs to know, which is excessive, obviously, and it's not realistic, obviously, but that's the feeling that I get when I go to a consulate. I'm like, here's my 6 inches of documentation saying I'm really good.
Yeah.
Let me in. I'm just gonna go read some stories.
And I think that's part of why I was drawn to the two of those as kind of a pair, is because they feel in some ways like some of the most explicitly about the stories that are told about us, right? About people. And so, in Foreigners, we get all of the details are within the control of this interviewer. And in tourism, it's a little bit different but we get the kind of faux objective language of a brochure that gradually gets kind of punctured by the personal details of the person who's traveling.
Yeah.
So, and it's something that I thought was also very much a thread throughout the rest of the collection, though kind of in different terms, about, kind of the distance between the stories that people tell about us or about people that we know and our own private experiences of those things, right? So many of the stories deal with characters kind of trying to live inside the tension between a story that is told about them versus their own experience, or as in the case of the first story, Heroes, right? So much of it is about the tension between the stories that gets told about this mother's son who has been killed versus her own experience of his life. Yeah. And the impossibility of kind of getting through that tension.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder just, it was that sense of storytelling, right, as kind of a little bit of a meta thread throughout the collection, something that you arrived at in or saw kind of as you were able to step back and look at the collection, or was it something that you were thinking about as you approached some of these stories?
Like the consciousness of writing between, like with the distance between the person in the story and the realities. I think I like the idea of coming down to the nitty gritty of what a person's mind is doing. Yeah. And because I think there's always a distance anyway between what we're thinking up here and what the reality is out there. So I am always trying to put that across in the stories, whether it's that kid in the first story who we never hear from directly, but we hear about him all the time. Yeah. And she finds out stuff about him, which you should read and find out.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. It's one of my favorites.
Oh, thanks. And so there's like always maybe parallel narrations, something not obvious to everyone else, but something really hyper obvious to one person, the narrator or the protagonist. And I think I do consciously try to work with that. Maybe because sometimes I feel that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. I think it's a tension that so many of us feel, especially those of us who have heritages or lived experiences in countries that are talked about within colonialist frameworks or have lived under colonialist histories, right? It becomes so much a matter of how you're able to exist within a framework that has been constructed to restrain you, right? And I mean, maybe along this line, one of my other questions or kind of thoughts was one of the things that I found the most personally valuable or resonant maybe about the collection as a whole was number one, it's very, very focused on character, very focused on character and interiority. And that's where I think we get so much of that sense of how people are thinking about themselves, how people are expressing or kind of enacting the things that they're missing, that they're lacking, that they're looking for. And one of the things that really hit home for me was how often people in the collection and the stories confuse their material circumstances with a moral value on themselves, right? That the desire to be successful or to be wealthy is the same as the desire to be good, right? And we see this in so many different ways throughout, right? Like, the character in Bulletproof Bus kind of taking this impossibility of escaping a cycle of poverty as a moral judgment on himself. We see it, in the acts, in an act of charity, right? That doing something that is explicitly right, that it's explicitly rooted in class relations and in the chance to kind of be financially successful. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about if that also is a tension that was kind of constructing the universe of the stories, right? I mean, thinking back a little bit to those connective tissues that we talked about, that was one of the things that I felt pulled me most strongly throughout the stories, was this confusion of, are my material circumstances who I am as a person?
Yeah,
right?
I think not all the stories, but definitely the idea of, I think it goes back to something we talked about earlier, struggling to define yourself. And by define, I mean, maybe at some point, if not yet, but these people will feel that they shouldn't be around because they're not useful, they're not productive, they're not good. And that's because of some pre-existing condition that they couldn't control so much, whatever it was, something they've been lacking, that idea of lacking again, that lacking of any kind of privilege. And by that, I don't mean just money. And this was shown to me in an interview when I heard Hanya Yankihara of Little Life. And she mentions like all the lacks of privileges in her book. She's like, this one doesn't have love. This one doesn't have money. This one doesn't have like, like he has racial tension in the city and among his friends. So there's all kinds of lacks, all kinds of things that destabilize somebody. And so in my stories, I think I like to go into the psyche of somebody who doesn't have that, whatever of those things, but they want to still be good, right? They want to still be useful. I think like when I wrote Loved Ones, for example, where there's that woman who comes back from a retreat and it's a mental health place, and she comes back from it and she's trying to insert back, like nothing happened, everything is good. But, and again, it's from that idea of usefulness. Yeah. I'm good now, I'm back. And it's like the guy in Bulletproof Bus, he wants to be good. But they're all trying to kind of prove their need to keep on existing in the world. Right. Yeah.
And I think, especially in Loved Ones, one of the lacks that's so present there, and in a lot of the other stories, I should say, is the lack of a kind of generous social network or a social structure that can take someone, for example, like in Loved Ones, who's been gone and is now kind of framed in the society as not useful or not productive, unstable. Right? Exactly, unstable, kind of dangerous to be around. The inability to have a social structure that can welcome them back in, and I felt this so much too in the story Transactions, right? Which is very much about the lack of others around this central character who has a need, right? A very specific need for support. And in many of the stories, it's about money, it's about love, it's about care and attention. And those things are just not present, right? In their larger networks. Well, I wonder if we might hear a little bit from the book. if you feel up to reading.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I'm gonna read that. I'm not gonna read that. Let's see. Okay, so I don't think I've ever read from this story, but I time myself, don't worry.
Ooh, exciting.
There's 1 minute marks all throughout. Okay, so I'm gonna read from an act of charity. After an hour in the tunnel, Shahid's legs started to cramp. He had been in a crouch the whole time, worried about getting his pants dirty by sitting on the layer of rubbish there. He reached out a hand slowly, and even more slowly, he brought his fingers down. He was afraid of feeling something damp, something soft, but it was dryness that he touched, paper or leaves maybe. He shifted until his body was above his hand and lowered himself onto whatever it was that was not rotting wetly. He straightened his legs and, in the relief of the blood flowing, he sucked in his breath, and the smell of dirty water from the open sewer made him choke. A breeze started to blow into the tunnel, and he took off his shoes and socks and wiggled his toes in the air. A few more minutes went by, and then, overcome with tiredness, lulled by the breeze, he lay down completely, his head on his shoes. It was a little after midnight. From the road outside, the sound of the traffic had gone away. Only the odd car whisper rushed, or truck sped by noisily. It was peaceful. He closed his eyes and slept. When he awoke, the day had begun. He crawled out of the tunnel, went home, showered, and went to work. A few weeks after this, he went with Mira to a party. The two of them had gotten engaged 6 months ago, when everything in Shahid's world seemed to be happening on schedule, when he could explain the restlessness inside him as just extra unchallenged energy. So he had taken up running, then a new language, then the possibility of a different job. Mira sometimes laughed and said as long as he didn't take up an expensive hobby, he could do whatever he liked. They had become best friends in college, and their engagement had been inevitable. She laughed at something he said as they walked up to their friend's house. He had not told her about the tunnel. The party was their friend's 1-year wedding anniversary celebration. By the time Shahid and Mira arrived, dinner had been laid out. The guests were allowed to respond to their respective hungers and go to the main dining area as they pleased. For almost 2 hours, the serving dishes were refilled as needed by the staff. In this crowd of people who had graduated only a few years ago, in these rooms full of comfortable pieces of furniture, under the flood of words from friends and acquaintances, everyone's faces lit up by soft yellow lights, Shahid felt warm and happy and calmer than he had in a while. He felt connected to all of these people's dreams and hopes and ambitions. He felt concerned when they brought up their parents' health and when they discussed work performances and the anxiety of being bypassed at their companies for fast-track lists to bigger roles. He was full of wordless admiration for Hina when she told him about her father's cancer treatments. He remembered from what Mira had told him that she worked almost around the clock and had 2 children, and now her husband was a successful person in the banking world. He was full of praise for Anisa, who, after just 1 year as a trainee in a marketing department somewhere, had made a right turn into the art world. He remembered she'd always painted large canvases of autumn trees with leaves covering the ground and winter scenes of snow-covered limbs of other kinds of trees. For a while now, she'd been painting whirling dervishes. Have you been to Turkey? Shahid asked stupidly last year at someone's wedding after Anisa had shown him a photo on her phone. No, she'd replied. These images come to me in a dream. She showed him new photos now at the party. Shahid did not understand them. They seemed to him more like streaks of colors in a suggestion of figures and less like actual figures, or incongruent backgrounds of tall buildings or highways instead of the earlier, more peaceful blues and greens. He put his incomprehension down to a lack of understanding about art in general. He wasn't even irritated by the things another friend, Ahmed, said to him, and Mira. Are you still stuck selling at that terrible detergent brand? Ahmed asked. Shahid nodded. And are you still saving lives or whatever it is you do at the Women's Welfare Association? Mira said, it's great, so eye-opening, you know. Shahid was proud of Mira for choosing to do the kind of tough work that her job asked her. Right here in these rooms were the very embodiments of reasons to want to live. Art, love, procreation, even the easing of an elderly parent's life toward death was a reason to want to live. And stop there.
Yeah. It is such a striking story. And I think part of that is that it feels like so many of the ideas that we've been talking about so far are really crystallized or contained in that story, which also has just one of my favorite openings in the collection. The tunnel, right? I mean,
I love that idea.
It's so wonderful. Is that how it started for you?
No, it was a very different story. So many years ago, it was all about a tunnel. I also like that one.
Yeah,
but I took that and put it here.
Yeah, that's great.
You have to be in a tunnel,
right? And well, listening to it again now, I think what I was really thinking about was this story in relationship a little bit to those kinds of distances between what we think we should be and what we are, right? As we were talking about a little bit, that Shahid is in terms of some of these things we've been talking about, like financial situation, like class, like fairly comfortable, right? He has a well-paying job that he doesn't find any real meaning in, right? So the lack that comes there is that sense of a different kind of productivity, right? A more collective kind of social work kind of productivity, right? That's missing. And so I just love how this story kind of offers us a little bit of the reverse, right? Where we've spent a lot of time with characters who are really struggling through poverty or through their financial situation. And we get to one who is not in that exact position, but still
wants out.
Exactly. Still wants to escape, still wants to go into a tunnel and just sit in a place that is kind of gross for a little bit, and so I wonder if just, another idea to think about a little bit is that idea of getting out, of escape, right, for so many of these characters, because it is something that really pervades so many of the relationships and situations in the stories, right? The idea of escape.
Happy people here.
Yeah, right.
Bursting with life.
Well, we'll talk about that. That will be my next question, actually.
Okay,
but just to think about a little bit about, like, about that idea of escape, how you think about it with these characters.
I think it's about people feeling trapped, and you can define for them, you should be so grateful, you've got everything you want.
Right.
Oh, that's what more do you want, right? See what I did there? But so I did I like to come sometimes to stories from an opposite angle, like the Foreigner's story, where it was about the visa guy instead of the people who were being interviewed, right? And here it's about a person who has pretty much, he's good,
right?
He's happily about to be married, or whatnot, and he's got a stable job, and which is, in terms of a checklist, you're covered. But he doesn't want that. He finds it unsatisfactory, but he can't, and he is trapped.
Yeah.
In the sense that he has this mountain of obligations upon him. So there is that isolation again, this inability to communicate what he wants because of how it'll be perceived.
Right.
Right? How can he go? And he tries to tell her, but the reaction.
It doesn't go very well.
Yeah. It's interesting. And she's afraid there's going to come at a cost to them, which is also a reality, right? So then there's a kind of that question, like, do you always get to go pursue what you want headlong? And it's okay if you don't live your ideal idea of a life.
Right. Yeah, the idea of just what you're willing to sacrifice and what the priorities are. Yeah, those trade-offs. Yeah. And one thing that I really want to kind of land on for a little bit is, as you said, that inability to communicate, which also feels like a thread for me through the stories, right? Is that so often there are these kinds of interior desires and lacks that we've been talking about, but they're also impossible to relate to the other people that these characters are in relationships with.
Yeah.
And my experience of the book is that really comes through so much in the language and in the voice of these stories. I really experienced this voice as this collection as a very voice heavy book, actually, in a lot of ways. And that voice tends to be, in my experience, like kind of very flat in a lot of ways, and then these moments of extreme emotion will rupture through, right? And so often these come as a result of accident or trauma or violence, right? There's a number of stories where some kind of accident or moment of violence is what allows these characters to have a real genuine emotional connection, right, to others. There's
maybe
gosh,
they're
you know,
like talking at each other.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
not
Or
really
speaking in
listening.
languages that are incompatible.
Yeah.
You know. So I wanted to just ask a little bit about those ideas of that idea of communication, right? And what the things are outside of these characters that allow them to communicate or stop them from being able to communicate. You know, what are those kinds of forces that are kind of shaping their ability to relate to one another, if that makes sense?
I think we'll come at your answer from a very different angle.
That's okay. Go for it. Yeah.
Under the ground.
Yeah. Through the tunnel.
Yeah, through the tunnel. Right. What I like to think about these people is that, you know, despite being in very tricky or difficult or trapped situations, mentally trapped or whatever, they do not want to be by themselves.
Yeah.
They don't want to be alone. They don't have a sense of their ending. They might be close to the edge, but they don't see it. But they keep going after relationships or a job or travel or what have you, you know, to get away or to find something. And to keep on trying to connect. Even the guy in tourism, right? He goes up there and bam, meet somebody.
Right. Yeah.
So they do persevere in that somehow. So they want to communicate, they want to talk, they want to find maybe they're optimistic.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We should ask them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's really something that's really wonderful about the book's approach overall, right? Is that it's not that it's impossible to find connection, but it's also not that it's the solution to everything.
Yeah,
right?
or
There's
easy.
kind of or easy, right? There's kind of an easy, like, you know, lovely fairy tale kind of version of stories, right? Which is that you live in hardship, but then if you find one person to share it with, suddenly everything's
everything is
fixed,
good, everything
right?
falls into place.
And you know, so much of this collection is about saying that it is simultaneously so vital to find those moments of connection, but also that it often comes too late. It often is not enough,
or not
right?
what you thought it
or
should
not what
be.
you thought it would
Yeah.
be. Yeah, exactly. So I just love how nuanced that approach to it is in the book. You know, I think it feels very refreshing to me.
Oh,
Thinking
thanks.
about the kinds of narratives that we tend to get exposed to. You know? Well, yeah. Maybe this is a time also to just, like, we can think about some other, like, crafty type questions.
Go
We
for
can keep
it.
thinking about some larger theme questions.
That
We can
old
think about,
tweet.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm gonna bring up that old tweet again.
Do that.
If you don't answer a question,
I'm a boring
in the way
tweet
that's good,
person.
yeah, exactly. But you know, one of the questions that to maybe think about, which I have, I think this is a kind of evil question, but also one that writers get asked a lot.
Mhm.
And so I offer it not as something that you have to answer, but maybe that we can just talk a little bit about or around.
Okay.
Right, which is the idea of, like, who your imagined or ideal or desired audience for the book is. Right. So it's a question that I have, like, kind of suspicions of, partially because I've never been able to answer it in a way that feels good. But I also think that it is something that maybe, as you now have, as we've talked about, like an object, right? A book that is going to be reaching people. It can be a little bit of like a starting point to think about how you envision creating a relationship with readers, like what that experience for a reader, what you kind of imagined it might be or hoped it might be, without having to focus on, like, my ideal audience member is named Jeff. He lives in Idaho. He has like 2 kids, you know, and just get very, very specific with it.
That was very specific.
And, you know,
Yeah.
I'm sure there is a book on these shelves whose ideal audience is Jeff, who lives in Idaho.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
She knows.
Yeah, exactly. Shady can point it out.
No, you know what? When I wrote, it was purely 100% only for me.
Yeah.
I'm a very angry person.
Yeah.
So it came out here.
Right.
I wasn't thinking about who's gonna read it. I think because maybe so many people here are stuck or trapped or unable to communicate. Maybe I wanted to put them and say, here's all of them trying to communicate, and not like voice for the voiceless kind of stuff. No,
Right,
just character-wise, like so and so has this issue and so is unhappy this way, or is unable to just break through that wall. It's like they feel like everything is there, out just within fingertips of reach, but they're unable to. So I just wanted to put various thoughts about that into all these stories.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't imagining an audience or a person, definitely not Jeff.
Right.
Though it could be a Jeff, who knows. But now that the book is here.
Right. Have you been thinking about it, differently?
Not really.
Now that it's there. Not really. That's okay. Yeah.
No.
There's a quote by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. Late in his life, he said, "I used to think that poetry could change the world, but now I think it changes only the poet."
Yeah.
Which is something that I come back to often, right? Because I think, especially in the contemporary literary landscape, which is kind of mostly, I think, in a lot of ways, from like a market perspective, saying, oh, this idea of diversity, of diverse voices, of voices from minoritized or marginalized communities is now kind of like sellable.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to publish a lot more of them. And there suddenly becomes all this pressure to have your book be the one that is topical and urgent, right?
Opens your eyes.
Yeah. How many blurbs or like write-ups of books have been, that it's got urgency, that it's a book we need right now. Yeah, it's timely, right? I mean, did they say that?
Not timely.
Right. Did people say that Moby Dick was like timely?
Right.
Probably not, but it's still with us. So, and I think it's something that I think about a lot, right? This pressure of having to have this specific call to action or call to understanding for a book, and it's really not how we tend to write. I think it's not our experience.
Not everyone who writes like that
right
to do that. And if I, for example, started to write with that, if I had a burning urgency in me, I would write like that. Mm-hmm. But I purely do write trying to understand a lot of things that are up here, in here. So, all the other things all the happy things we talked about earlier.
Right.
But, and in those things come all the other issues that I think are forever. Happiness, unhappiness, relationship, class, struggle, all that. But there is so much pressure to produce a timely piece of work, or just not the right time to get this book out or it doesn't have enough.
Right, or it needs to be more Palestinian. It needs to be more Pakistani, right?
Yeah.
In ways that are legible to this suddenly wider audience.
Yes,
which is one of the questions I had actually, because something that I feel a lot is this urge to kind of like subvert or kind of write against like these symbols and expectations of what a Palestinian poem or performance or book looks like. And I wondered if there was a similar kind of if there were any similar kind of feelings as you were writing this book, or maybe as you were preparing for it to go into this much wider audience, right? If there were things that you were kind of thinking about.
Yeah, I do get prickly when someone asks,
right.
You should talk, it would fit more easily into so-and-so.
Yes.
If we just turn up the volume on so-and-so.
Exactly.
I'll be like, no, I can't do that. I mean, it'll be really false.
Yeah.
It's not like I don't know what that would ultimately mean. Maybe it won't connect on that marketable level.
Right.
Maybe 100 years later.
But
somebody might have behind a
shelf
shelf
to you and what you need, right? As a writer.
Yeah, so that's like what Darwish said, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's for the person primarily.
Yeah.
A lot of the writing.
Yeah.
And it does, if you do it long enough, truly it is only about yourself. Even if you're talking about things that are bugging you in the world, or that are issues or urgent issues, which, should be talked about. But ultimately it's what the writer feels, right?
Yeah. I mean,
unless it's just reproducing stuff, which is just mechanical.
Fun. Yeah, exactly. Fun. Right. And even just that idea of representation.
Exactly.
Which is just
regurgitating stuff.
Right. Yeah. Reconstructing these kinds of ideas or images. And it goes back to, I think, something that we said right at the very beginning, right? Which is, now I've completely lost it, right? But the idea of problems, right? We read about problems in a particular context or location or homeland that has also been talked about already by other people in terms of its problems.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of like impossible bind that you get in.
It is impossible because damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly.
But don't talk about mangoes or don't talk about monsoons. I mean, I don't talk about them because they're not interesting to me.
I
But
there was a single mango in this.
Not a single
one. I was furious.
It didn't even rain, did it?
Actually, it did rain at the end of one story.
It did.
It was a
I
big
have to look
deal.
at it again.
Yeah.
But again, to be told don't write because it's been done, that also bugs me because why not? It's my stuff to tell.
Yeah.
And if it's been done, then too bad. Or to be told and to avoid it because it is a trope, right? That's that overused word. That also makes me prickly. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think simultaneously there's like an expectation, especially once you get into these environments where there's suddenly wider audiences who may not be familiar with the kinds of histories and contexts and places that you're writing from, to kind of like, okay, it needs to have a sort of 101 element, right? It needs to have some like explanation backstory of like, what is Karachi? Like, how did it happen? What are all these historical details?
It is a very big city with many people.
Exactly, right. Karachi was founded in, right. But that pressure too, to write from a place that assumes that your audience doesn't know certain things.
And you don't care to explain it.
And for me, exactly, that's been such a big move in the last few years, is to say, I don't have time for that. It's not interesting to me.
Yeah.
It's not helpful to me. It doesn't allow me to write about any of these things that I'm interested in writing about if I have to imagine an audience that I have to do that work for them.
Yeah, and it goes back to that thing when we read Russian literature, for example.
Right.
Yeah, they have loads. Have you read it?
So much history.
And then they have nicknames.
Yeah, exactly.
They have like 5 names, and then there's like a nickname, so you have to keep track of who. Like, you do it.
Right. Yeah.
Right? I mean, or if I'm reading Hemingway or whomsoever from way back, or now, there's a lot about American culture that is not native to me or instantly understandable, but if you do it to understand, all of this is America, or all of this is Europe, or all of this is Palestine.
Right.
Then you're not reading closely enough.
Right.
Or
and it's also
widely
it's
enough.
impossible. The one piece of writing from one person cannot be that representational magic thing.
Exactly.
I mean, when I was in 7th grade at the library reading Jane Austen books, it took me forever to understand like the naming conventions of all the daughters, where like one of them was Miss Bennet, that's the oldest one, and then like all the other ones had names, and I was like always so confused.
You know what confused me though?
What?
The use of the word country.
Yes.
Like what? Where are they now?
Yeah, right.
Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Countryside, not villages like we say back home. So.
Yeah. I mean, and these vocabularies that certain vocabularies that we're expected to learn and know, and certain vocabularies that we are expected to explain to others.
Yeah, and I don't care to explain.
Yeah, it's just not fun. It's not engaging.
If you ask me nicely, I'll tell.
Right. But we also now have magic boxes that can do all the explaining for us.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what are some other things that you want to talk about with the book? I'm just gonna, because I feel like in this situation, right, I have so much power as the questioner. To sort of decide which of the little threads. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm at Fargo in DC.
I'm gonna show up in your next
Change your name.
I knew it, but so and I feel like I want to just allow. I think for myself, when I talk about my own work, a lot of times there's things that I would love to talk about that I don't get to talk about. And I just want to open the space right now for any of those things for you, right? What are the things that you haven't been asked about? What are the things that you want to ask others about, about their experience about that you just haven't been able to yet? Or if there are any, and if not, that's okay too. I can come up with another question.
No, I'm going to put a question to you because you read this.
Yeah.
So what were your expectations going into the collection?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Good job. Did we switch?
Yeah, we did.
I don't know.
Knowing that it's from by a person from Pakistan, for example,
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, one of the things that it really revealed was, for me personally, a lack of context. Right. I felt myself going in that space of not knowing what my expectations should be. Right. And I think then, as I read through, there was a part of me that was trying to read it and do exactly what we've been talking about, right? Read it as these are Pakistani stories, right? This is somehow going to translate to me the histories and context of this place. And I think because of the way that the stories work, because they're so focused on character and they're so focused on specificity, right, in detail and in interaction and voice, I very quickly was able to let go of that expectation.
Yeah. Having the expectation part is human nature.
Of course,
honestly.
Yeah.
It's the letting go or giving up on a work because it doesn't fit your ideals and like, okay, it's not for me because,
being unable
nothing
to
is blowing up in this book.
Unable to live in that tension.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, so I think for me, I was, I just let go of those because I was so drawn into each story's particular language, and each story's particular characters and the ways that that all of these things we've been talking about so far were contained and kind of explored in each story in such different ways.
Oh, thanks.
Look, I'm just going to say it right now, it's a very, very, very good book. It's very, if you haven't gotten this now, it's really, really good. I would highly recommend that everyone give it a read.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a huge fan of short stories, and this is one of my favorite collections that I've read, definitely in the last few years.
Thank you. But you also write short stories.
Well, kind of.
You do.
Okay.
You do.
But
maybe
the last sort of just general question, which is a little less like pressure on it. It's just as you were writing or as you were kind of thinking about the book, were there other books, other writers that you felt were, influences is maybe a little tricky word, but just ones that you felt like you were in conversation with or ones that you borrowed things from? I steal things from other writers all the time. I'm probably going to steal things from this book. So what were the people you stole from, wanted to talk to, wanted to kind of be in conversation with?
So when I started taking writing seriously, because I don't have an MFA or anything, it was, I've been reading forever, but I started reading with a conscious effort to understand the structure of a short story. And I started reading Grace Paley.
Yeah.
And bam, it was right away. I love her work so much. What she keeps off the page, how little she shows, but gets so much across, all those things. And so she had a story called Friends, I think. And it was about some women who are coming to terms with different things that have happened to them. And so when I wrote Together, which is in this collection, it was, I still had the effect of Friends, of Paley's story.
Yeah, you can see those connections there.
So that's one clear cause and effect, maybe,
Yeah.
But also I read Jim Shepard's Love and Hydrogen.
Yeah.
Which I cannot forget. It just the way, like on a craft level.
Right.
In the end, there's like a point of view switch over. And I was like, oh, he can do that.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah.
You don't have to be by the book. You can have multiple, if you can, do it well enough, you can be as wild as you want. So I think one thing that I took away from reading a lot of short fiction is that you can just write whatever the hell you want.
Yes. Yeah. I think that is so, all of the moments that I have felt most compelled to write, like when you read something you're like, I need to go write, is all of those moments.
Exactly.
And I think I also don't have an MFA. I don't have any like kind of classical training in literature, which I find very valuable, partially because I think we haven't necessarily been told what you're supposed to do. We haven't been like kind of regulated into a style. And so
I love stay mad our way.
Yeah, exactly. We get to live in that space of like, you can just write whatever you want. Which I find very liberating. And I think, all of the books that I have felt so drawn to are the ones that have been like, oh, I had no idea you could do that.
Yeah, exactly.
All those moments.
You could have a whole book in the present tense, or if you read Gina Reese's Why Sargasso Sea, it was mind-blowing for me.
Yeah.
The whole surreal, eerie atmosphere that's deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
That I read it in the pandemic was not a great idea, but
absolutely.
It showed me that you can literally write whatever.
Yeah.
How your mind wants to work. And if you read her interviews, she says, I only write about myself, what she knows, what she knew. So
yeah. Well, I wonder if we might open up to some questions from all of you, if you have any, if there are any things that you're thinking about after our incredibly insightful, riveting conversation. don't say anything otherwise. But yeah, just if folks have questions, we can talk about them. Yes.
I think it's really interesting that as you write the book about Karachi as somebody from Karachi, so by default you kind of become an authority on the city a little bit.
Yeah.
Were there any characters you had to work really, really hard to understand and found yourself realizing that I actually don't know that much about this facet of Karachi?
Well, I don't, because I am from there, born and raised and whatnot, and I know the essence of Karachi is in these, but there's a reason, except for that one tourism story, there's a reason I haven't named any specific neighborhood or, generally speaking, I've steered clear of those because it's a Karachi collection in my head. And I didn't want it to be consciously about that city. So writing about the people, no, I didn't discover anything about my city that the character helped me understand about it more. More like the effect of the city was in the people all the time, in its structures or in its obstacles or in its conveniences or just in its things, These are the things, these are the places. Here's a beach that a man goes to sell some food on, and there's a mention of that. Or here is a neighborhood where clearly they're not living in ideal conditions. And there's a mention of that. I think mostly it was images that have been in my head forever, and it's that city is an assault on the senses in every sense of the word. So it all just came out here. Yeah, I just think it's just a little more about the people than about the city.
Hi, I haven't read the book yet, so the question is not super informed. I was wondering, have you lived in the US for the past couple of years, like outside Pakistan, I would be assuming?
No, I lived outside. I was in Damascus, Syria for 3 years when I was a kid. And then we did live, my husband and kids moved here 2009.
Okay.
Yeah,
because I'm
for 3
wondering, like,
years.
to what extent do you think the moving away from Karachi has affected writing about it? Like,
That's a
as you
good
know, like,
question.
an outside perspective to some extent.
Yeah. It's like I've lived in a bunch of places. Right now I don't live here. I live in Dubai, in the UAE. I don't think I could ever write about that though. But changing my perspective on Karachi in a fictional sense, no. If I were to write an essay on it though, it'll be so sentimental. You would think a different person wrote it. But in my fiction, I think because I love the place stupid much, so it just has to be present. So I didn't look at it a different way. No, maybe in its aspects of, I think when I write about a person and what they're facing or what they're going through, then yes, actually how they're navigating their life in that city, then I would start recognizing the effects of it. Having lived there, obviously I wouldn't have, I'm lit this way because of so-and-so happened and so-and-so happened. But writing about these people, yeah, it did help me sometimes see the connection that this tension right now is being exacerbated by this pre-existing circumstance, which is a city problem. So yeah, in that way.
So do you get different reactions to your writing depending on if people are from Karachi or people are from somewhere else? Like,
All right, let's see. People who are from Karachi who have actually written my book are my husband. So and some friends. Can I narrate the question to you guys?
I just got the book yesterday.
Yeah. Run now, run.
even like people from Pakistan.
Okay, actually, you know what? Yeah, that reminds me. So years ago, I met a friend who, this is before the book came out, and he read all my stuff, and he's a big supporter. And we met for lunch with other friends, and he's like, I like your writing a lot, but we're not really like this all the time. He had a very strong reaction. He's like, not all men are bad, and Karachi's not all horrible. And I said, I don't write to show that all men are bad or that my city sucks. It's literally just what I felt and noticed came out on the page. So he definitely had that kind of reaction, and probably others would too. Yeah, it's that idea of the trope thing.
Yeah, it's that strange transformation that can happen where, you know, one story suddenly means that this is all you believe about
Yeah,
every single thing
exactly.
in the story.
Except
Yeah.
even though that there's now stories here that are in which, you know, the man is the one who's stuck, and the partner calls the shots, for example, and he is too gentlemanly or whatever, too pressured to make a break for it, for example. But yeah, I have had that reaction, and from people who are not from there, they just, I don't know, I think it's more like what he said, it's trying to get a sense of the place. They don't know what I'm talking about. What is this land?
That's interesting because I understand why someone from Pakistan, I don't know, maybe they might feel okay, this is like an image that's being projected about us, and
Yeah.
because there's not that much alternative from what people see in the news, they might be like, okay, so we have to
That is true.
you know. But I don't know. I also feel like you should just write, you know, what you feel and not care too much about.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of science fiction being written out of Pakistan. Wild amounts of it. I mean, we have a whole award thing going up, and it's been. And Jeff Vandermeer was a judge one time. So I mean, there is stuff happening. It's just maybe not falling into easy narratives about. Oh, we could write like that too. I think it's like there was this issue of Palestinian future focused like science fiction stories that came out in Strange Horizons, I think. So that whole idea that we don't always have to talk about an aspect. I don't write like that, but it is definitely there.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I definitely I intend on reading, but not yet.
Thank you.
But I noticed other people talking about it, and the word transformation is used. And I'm wondering, as you were writing these stories, were there moments of personal transformation that you had along the way?
I mean, if I healed myself.
I guess there's something intuitively healing about writing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very clear about in my head now that these were trying to understand some stuff. I think, yeah, and the answer to that is kind of goes to the title, that people want to live. That no matter how desperately bad some of their situations are, they do want to. There's not always a way out. That's a bad way of putting it, but they don't want to stop just yet. You know, I think that's the thing that I took away from it as a writer. Yeah.
I really love the title. Just to hop onto that for a second, because number one, because it's kind of a very direct, blunt description of what happens in the book.
Should be an exclamation mark at the end.
Yeah. Well, it's also like, well, what is the book about? And it's like, well, it's about people who want to live, right? Which is interesting. But I also just love that. So, and I think it really acts for me as a corrective to so many of these kinds of things that we've been talking about, even in these questions about like, well, is it about how bad things are? Is it about like X kind of context in the city that is dangerous or harmful? And it's really about the fact that all of these circumstances are different and specific, and in all of them, it's about people who want to live.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it's kind of just this really fundamental quality that unites the stories and gives them, I think, that sense of like, you know, hope, right, that you talked about earlier, or optimism, I think is how you called it, right?
Or oblivion, or
all of these things, right? And it finds itself enacted in so many different ways for different characters. But there's a central concept, right, that like most of all they want to live, you know.
Yeah.
And I just think it was something that really carried me through each story, even when they were very dark, even when they were very tender and kind of like lovely in their relationships. But the main thing that I was able to kind of latch on to was that central idea.
Yeah. And you know, the title and what you said and what you asked, kind of, there's like a dot connecting the dots thing there, because when I was before I figured out that there's like maybe something in the stories that connects them all together. I came across an article, which was basically a bunch of interviews of suicide hotline workers, and they all said pretty much that people want to live. And so that made me think about these people. And they're not on the edge, like I've said, or maybe they don't realize, but they do just keep pushing through.
Yeah.
I think I have a question.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book, but I do have a question.
Go for it.
I think whenever you write a book for, let's say, you might not say that you have an audience in mind when you write the book, but the expectation that it might be read by an audience that doesn't share the same cultural background or values, it might be the West somewhere. Does that in any way, do you think, factor into when you're writing a story subconscious? Well, it's difficult to answer for us.
No, it's a good question.
But the question is that's really the question. Does that factor in anywhere in the writing, or how the writing goes, or where the plot lines go?
Well, so on a personal level, I do write from a place of like intensity, and I really don't think about will they understand this? Will they not understand this? Oh no, this is a broken staircase. They'll think all the box sounds like that. But when it goes to an editor, then sometimes I've been said, the first interesting thing for me, by the way, is that I unconsciously sometimes use British English because that's how we study, right?
Yeah.
But my spellings are American, but my English has a lot of shells in it, so it becomes wills and gray spelled differently, apparently.
Yes.
And sometimes I've been told sometimes that the names are too similar, and that bugged me, but I was like, maybe not a hill I want to die on, so fine, I'll use that. Those are the times when an editor's eye, and I understand their thing as well, I guess, where I'm forced to look at it from how it would be read literally by someone who's not from back home. But when I'm writing it, then no, because I'm really only interested in exploring the people. And I think if you strip away the names completely, then you will be left with just an idea of a lack of something, and here's a person, and now how are they going to get through? How are their brains going to collapse or whatever? So, yeah.
We have time for one more.
Earlier, you were talking about like how they're trying to be like productive or within like some sort of whole or community. Do you feel like a lot of this is like kind of based off of like the pressure, or like even like the psychology of like disposability, and in that sense, like how do we live now with like this burgeoning population, and how like globalization has kind of shifted the ways that our communities are like, did that play into that? And because it sounds like a lot of this is like the human condition.
Yeah.
Adapted.
So not consciously I'm going to explore that, but definitely as a trait of like as an existing circumstance that they're all living under that pressure to constantly produce and do good and be useful and fit in and be functional. Is that word, right? Be functional. I don't know what that guest says, this box of you're well or you're unwell. If you're unwell, you're disposable, or you should be put aside, or you have to be dealt with. And so, yeah, I think definitely that idea of people struggling to define themselves, but more on a human level, more as a need, I don't think they're looking at how maybe they want to prove it to the world, but maybe just want to prove it to themselves that, no, I'm struggling, or I'm not all there, but I still should go on. I'm not useless. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you both so much. Really incredible conversation. I'm so glad to have you here. We have a few more minutes where everyone's welcome to partake of the wine and cookies and all that stuff. Mingle. If you haven't gotten your book yet, they are here. And Farah, if you would like to sign them, there are pens available for you. Otherwise, please mingle, get to know each other, chat for a bit. We do close in about 15 minutes. You're welcome to stay a little past close, but
Thank you so much for this, and thank you for
Thank
all your
you,
cool
yes.
questions. It was such a fun conversation.
Yeah, it was. I will cancel you next time. I'm
I'll
sending that
delete my
tweet.
Twitter
Yeah.
before that.